Welcome to the SIWIKE Podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE Podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here with two guest hosts, Valerie and Nahian. How are you doing today, both of you?
Great. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. So we thought we'd get the two of them together because in their stories, one of the common topics was the concept of imposter syndrome, right? So it's one of the challenges that, well, I struggle with myself, and I'm sure many of the folks out in the audience do as well. So we thought we'd kind of demystify it a little bit, talk a little bit more about it, and hopefully normalize it and maybe give a few tips and tricks in order to help out. So how does that sound to the both of you?
Sounds great.
Sounds good. So we'll start off with a few definitions. So I pulled off from the Googles, and it says it's the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or you has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own effort or skills, right? And apparently there's 5 different types, or I don't know, subtypes you might want to call it, where you have kind of the perfectionist, where you have to be kind of the perfect, right? There's 0 flaws. You can't make a mistake, that sort of thing. The natural genius, right? I know I identify most with this one, where I was supposed to be smart and anything else, like if I wasn't naturally able to do it, I couldn't do it. The individualist, sometimes the rugged individualist, right? So I have to do everything by myself. Anything achieved with other folks, it's not worthwhile. The expert, it's kind of like the know-it-all. You have to know everything, similar but different than the perfectionist. And then the superhero, right? So this is the person who basically does it all and without complaining, right? So they have the full-time job, they have the family that they're raising, they also sit on the board of directors of a not-for-profit, and they have their own startup business which they've sold as with a nice exit, and they like walk old ladies across the street. That's sort of the ultimate Boy Scout. So those are kind of the dictionary definitions, and I'd love if we chatted a little bit about experiences. So maybe Valerie, since you kind of brought us together, I'd love if you kind of share a little bit about maybe what imposter syndrome means to you, and we'll kind of dive into that discussion.
Thank you, Luki. I'm glad that I could bring us all together in the name of discussing imposter syndrome. This is something that I personally have experienced and, often do feel myself experiencing. And I think many of our audience members do as well. So I'm glad that we can get together and talk about this really pertinent topic. And thank you, Luki, for listing out those 5 different kind of archetypes. I could identify and relate to many of them, including especially the perfectionist and individualist, right? Feeling the need to do everything myself, that the world is on my shoulders. I think that could be influenced by my upbringing, being the eldest daughter of a refugee family, being the oldest sibling, and feeling that like I need to take care of everyone and everything, right? And I have to do it perfectly as well. And if I can't do it perfectly, I get so down on myself, right? And sometimes don't give myself that grace, right?
Right.
That I could be giving that. And many other people have shown me, but I often don't give it to myself. I find myself being really hard on myself.
And I'm wondering if you're willing to share maybe one of the earliest cases that you might have experienced or that you recall, right? So you might not know exactly, but where did imposter syndrome first rear its ugly head in your life?
First rear its ugly head? Probably very early on. I mean, sadly. And, I mentioned my upbringing earlier, being from, Asian Canadian, from a Vietnamese Canadian background. I think growing up, coming from that kind of more conservative cultural background, there was that high expectation to achieve and do well. And I felt that from a very young age. So I feel like imposter syndrome reared its ugly head very early on in life. Like I'm talking early grade school, right? I'm talking like age 6 and under even, feeling the need to be that good older sister, even though I was a kid. It's like kids looking after other kids and doing well in school. I think that was impressed upon me from that young age.
Yeah, it can be a pretty trying time in kind of that cultural upbringing. Nahian, about yourself, when can you say you first experienced the lovely imposter syndrome?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint it because in some sense it's a learned behavior. And I think Valerie, and then Valerie, I think you touched on it as well. It's kind of this notion of you are to be dependable, but you can't necessarily depend on others. And I think that's kind of the script that's kind of hardwired, one way or another. And when that begins, maybe at birth, who knows, right? For me, I would say, I can't pinpoint an exact date, around when I was 8 years old. I think that's more when I remember, distinctly that my sense of self was quite significantly changed. And I think a lot of that came from, like I said, an accumulation of messages, right? And so, in our family, we were big on, not bragging, and trying to shy away from arrogance. And I think that's good in its own right, but I think then you can always take that too far, where, my sisters and I actually have conversations about this to this day of, anytime something good happened to us, of course we're thankful. And I think that's important to have gratitude because, you're rarely ever alone on your journey, but to also recognize your own woe. And we had a lot of the former, which is the gratitude, and not a lot of the latter, which is, taking ownership for your own successes. And so I think that, and I understand why my parents wanted to do that. They don't want braggarts. They don't want, but at the same time, even now, I'm talking to a therapist who helped me a lot in the past. We were talking about these things again, and he recognized that pattern. And like he says, you really struggle to compliment yourself, right? And in a professional setting, it's the exact same thing. Like you don't constantly just say, "Oh, I'm great" or whatever, but believing that you have the capacity to do the job that you've done for a long time, or the fact that you have the capacity to learn something that's outside of your current realm of knowledge. It comes down from the same script of, am I capable? If I am capable, well, am I really capable? Was it my own doing, or was it somebody else's doing? Right. So I think I understand, Valerie, where you're coming from.
Yeah, I think from my experience, it was much later in life. Right. Well, and maybe that's because I'm referring to more of when I identify it as, oh, this is definitely imposter syndrome, maybe first reading the definition or someone talking about it. So it was probably later into my career, probably earlier into my career, where I was a consultant. I had a team around me, and I was using the technology for 3 months longer than they had. and I was supposed to manage a team of like 7 people. Right. So it's kind of like reading the manual beforehand, and then running the workshop, and then running off to the hotel room and doing it again to be a day ahead. And that's when I first, I guess, was introduced to that concept. But I can recall that there were earlier moments where it's like, okay, that's definitely imposter syndrome. That's definitely imposter syndrome. That's definitely imposter syndrome. But at that point, I didn't really have a name for it. So I guess that's my experience. Yeah, it's anxiety. It's kind of, as you said, feeling that you're not good enough. And I do appreciate that concept of like not being grateful and all of the compliments of the achievements that you have, not being able to embrace the good things that you've been able to do. I think that's a key element as well. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit, both of you, and maybe Nahian first, on when did you feel that you could actually do something about it, right? So you've kind of lived with it. It's been part of your upbringing, maybe ingrained in your psyche. The voices in your head are parroting imposter syndrome all day long. And then you realize, okay, well, this is something I could do something about. Do you recall a time when you recognized that? Yeah, I mean, Valerie and I had talked about this a while ago, where it was when I think it was about 2019, when I was talking to a therapist who really kind of helped me come to terms with myself. And like, the idea of that, of psychology that he practices is that essentially your mind is fragmented, and not like in a bad way, but like there's different parts of a single individual. And he helped me come to terms with the part of me that believed these, I guess that had these principles and these fundamental beliefs that it was incapable, or
especially by that time in my career, because by that point I had been a project manager for almost 6-7 years. And so, as I continued and I was dealing with some, a case of imposter syndrome where I was kind of struggling to get back into my field, and I'm thinking, am I even valuable in this? He helped me come to terms with that knowledge of, you've been doing this for 6 years, so why would you think that all of a sudden you're incapable? Right? There is a logical approach to imposter syndrome as well that I think helps a lot, where a lot of times the thing that you think you aren't able to do, you're already doing in some capacity. And as a career coach in project management, I actually talked to a lot of people about this. There's one individual in particular who, he's an operations manager. He's doing it for many years. And he was saying, I'm trying to get this job in project management. I had applied for other jobs. I got an interview. And at the interview stage, I bomb. And he's like, I don't think that I can do project management. So I said, okay, well, break it down into individual skills. Have you done schedule management? Have you done scope management? Have you done, scheduling? I think it's a scheduling. Have you done budgeting? And he said yes. So I said, no, what's holding you back? What is it that you think you can't do? And after we had the conversation, thankfully, he actually got a project management role. So it just shows you that, and in my own case, it's one of those things where it's easy to give some of that advice and hard to follow it yourself. And I think this therapist kind of helped me realize that I've been doing it all along. But there's no reason for me to, at this point, at this stage, to think that I can't do it, right?
For sure. And I'm glad that your therapist was able to help you. And I'm reminded of the quote, don't believe everything you think.
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes those voices in your head,
exactly.
It was implanted by, I don't know, earlier childhood memory, mom and dad or older cousin, sibling, someone randomly, which served you at some point in time, but now may not have the same effect. So
exactly.
Valerie, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that moment, or a moment where you felt that you could actually do something after understanding this imposter syndrome thing that we're talking about.
Thank you, Nahian, for sharing. Really grateful that, yes, Nahian and I have had many conversations about this, hence bringing this podcast together. So as for a moment in time where I felt like, okay, something could actually be done, I would also say in the throes of therapy as well. I think Nahian and I were both, we both been through it. We go through it. And by it, I mean therapy. I think having a professional to help you kind of deconstruct those thoughts and reframe those beliefs and give you more life-affirming beliefs as well, that has been really affirming and validating. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So being able to spin imposter syndrome on its head from getting an outside perspective, someone who's trained and professional, has been really instrumental in taming the beast.
Yes. Sounds good.
Exactly.
And can you share a moment where maybe you would have had imposter syndrome? It's like, oh no, I see you coming. So I'll invite you to the table and bring you along for the ride, or avoid you altogether. I don't know, Valerie, if you have an instance that you could share.
Sure. Well, I shared in our first podcast recording about my adventure to South Korea. So that was a time where I think the inner pull of adventure and what lay ahead actually overrode the imposter syndrome. Because truly, in a sense, I could have pointed to myself you're an imposter. Who do you think you are going? I've never taught before. I didn't know the language. But I had that really strong pull and the inner belief that helped kind of silence that imposter syndrome inner critic. So I think having some greater vision for yourself that really is pulling you forward can really pull you through when the imposter syndrome, that inner nasty critic, is rearing its head. Right? It still is going to be there, probably going to come along for the ride, but having that vision really help you move forward.
Yeah, very well said.
I think that's definitely a good story. And for those that want to go back into the episode, you can listen to it in its entirety. But it's definitely something where imposter syndrome can be overcome by, let's say, sense of adventure or greater purpose or things like that. But sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to deal with. And Nahian, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of a moment that you might have found where okay, here it is, and maybe you rode the wave of imposter syndrome and able to surf it instead of having it overwhelm you?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, this is kind of a cop-out answer, but all the time. and I think Valerie hit the nail on the head, and that it does take a lifetime of vigilance, and I do think that in itself is the lesson, right? That voice of dissent, or whatever you want to call it, exists for a reason, and I don't think it's trying to be malicious. And that, I think that's what really the therapist helped me come to terms with, and I think it's something that you can come to terms with yourself, without necessarily getting a therapist, depending on where those doubts come from, of course. But it's anytime I'm given, for example, a big project, and the first initial thought is, oh, can we do this? And this we is this, this it's a singularity, but it's also plurality in my head of can we do this? And it's just a matter of yes, we can, because we've done it before, right? So it's just a process. It's that voice will always be there, at least in my opinion, and I'm okay with it. It will always be there to protect me. Right. And I think if I look at it as a protector, but then also say, okay, at this time, I don't need protection, but thank you, then I'm able to move beyond that. Right. So yeah, I mean, this happened recently. If you want to really, if you want something more temporal. Yeah. Like I was given a big project about 2 weeks ago. And that same thought process occurred. And then I was able to move past it within minutes, as opposed to younger me would have taken probably days, weeks, years,
Yeah. And I think that's one thing for folks to recognize is, unfortunately, it doesn't go away, right? Yeah. What hopefully happens is you're able to manage it better, manage it quicker. Yes. As you said, that would have normally taken you days, if not longer, to manage. It was in the span of minutes that you were able to do it. And I love what you say about having it as a voice that exists for a reason, right? Yeah. It's there to keep you safe, to be your protector, right? So as long as you can, well, first you want to recognize that the voice is even there. Yeah. And then you want to accept. Yes. Right. And once you accept that, as Valerie mentioned, like it'll be there, right? But it doesn't mean that it has to take over and kind of disable you from being able to do things in the future. It can actually be a great indicator to say, hey, you know what? There's something not right here. We might want to address it in some shape or form.
And in addendum to that, if you don't mind, something Valerie and I have spoken about before, especially if you look at a lot of motivational coaches or people, the LinkedIn scene is full of this, of the way you approach a lack of confidence or imposter syndrome, which they come hand in hand. It's almost like the narrative is that this imposter voice is a dragon. Like you have to slay the dragon. It's something that you have to destroy, get rid of it, and again, I don't think that that's necessary. It comes down to my teachings from my parents of it exists for a reason. I think that the voice in me comes from a lifetime basically of not necessarily giving myself credit when I'm due credit, but also being very grateful for the multiple factors that allow me to achieve some sort of goal, to achieve some sort of success. That voice does exist for a reason. It's not just there to be slain or whatever. It's a friend, but it's a friend that's giving you maybe inappropriate advice for that specific scenario.
Yeah, I love that. Where if you can bring that voice, that friend, along with you on the journey, right? So it's a very well-meaning friend, and as you said, what they're saying at the moment might be inappropriate and not helpful. Yes, but at the end of the day, like they are part of you. They are in some shape or form trying to keep you safe. Yeah, and it is definitely something that people need to acknowledge and then continue the journey with. So, and
it also balances the narrative. Sorry.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And I'm wondering if both of you could share some of your strategies, your tips to help deal with it. So let's say someone's in the throes of a full bout of imposter syndrome, or maybe even before that, like before we get into the depths of it, like what are some of like the warning signs? What are some of the things to look out for to know, oh, okay, here it's coming. It's coming. Nahian or Valerie, which one, or Nahian, I guess for yourself, right? What were some of the the strategy you would have in order to first recognize it?
Yeah, I mean, something we talked about earlier was it's essentially anxiety, right? When you'll know it. You'll have this sensation, or maybe it's like an actual narrative in your head saying, "Can I do this? Can I?" Like that. That's right. The foundational question. Can I do this? And I mean, the answer to that question is always like, what makes you think you can't? Right. Yeah. So getting past that, and that question has so many layers to it, right? And that's why I think when Valerie and I, when we talked about it, getting therapeutic help was, I don't know, it maybe may have been necessary, may not have been necessary, but I think it definitely opened our eyes to that fundamental question. But it's a question that anybody can ask themselves as to what makes you think you can't do it. And what evidence do you have otherwise? And so, something when Valerie and I were talking about this, something I mentioned is essentially what I do now is I build a legal case against my own brain, right? Okay. Of like, okay, the default state is thinking, oh, I'm not capable. Well, here's kind of my resume. Here's what I've accomplished, right? Despite that voice being there, so I am capable, right? So it's just, I think that's the at least one of the first steps is, you want to look at the little victories and not the larger battle, right? Mm-hmm. And it's actually really related to another therapy that's administered called self-efficacy training. So essentially you get somebody to do small tasks that they are able to achieve, and then they feel more and more confident to tackle larger tasks. It's something anybody can do. Make your bed, make your breakfast. That's a victory. You took care of yourself for the day. That's a victory, right?
That's amazing. Yeah. So it seems like you're a part-time lawyer, I guess, compared to in your own head, for sure. Yeah. Right. And I'm curious because both of you went through the therapeutic route. Like, I mean, is that a requirement for folks, or it's just highly recommended? Because obviously, talking to yourself, right, you can do that. But as I think both of you alluded to, having some professional help would be useful. So maybe having that external party helping you recognize some of these anxieties would be helpful. But I mean, if you want on your own, to just reflect back and say, like, can you recall a time when any of these thoughts that we mentioned were in your head? And then seeing how you can build a legal case against it, right. And adapt that, and maybe build some of this kind of self-efficacy training in order to counteract what the prosecutor would be arguing in that particular case. Right. Valerie, I'm wondering if you could share some of the helpful tips and tricks and strategies that you've come across that would help folks in their bout to accept imposter syndrome.
Sure. Thank you, Nahian, for sharing that. I really like what you shared about building a legal case against the imposter. So I think one way to counteract that is to look at previous examples of wins that demonstrate that actually you are qualified to do what you're doing, right? And that could be like accomplishments that you've had, major wins. What I've told clients before is to create a brag book. Actually, I need one of these myself. Create a brag book, especially when you're feeling kind of down and crappy and maybe not feeling so great about yourself. Maybe the imposter syndrome is really getting to you and telling you that you're not capable or causing a lot of self-doubt. I think it's really positive to look at those examples of previous wins that you've had, and even, the really kind, amazing things that people have shared with you before, to help you remember, okay, yeah, well, I ain't so bad after all, right? And I think a daily activity that can help with that self-efficacy training is, like Nahian mentioned, taking note of those little victories. So it could be like making your bed, making breakfast, even just like caring for yourself. Adulting can be really tough, right? So even if you're able to do those little things for yourself, like that's a win. That shows that you are doing actually pretty well, and making it into a daily habit. Maybe some people like having a gratitude journal, maybe in addition to writing down what you're grateful for, also writing down your wins for the day, as well as what you appreciate about yourself as well. I think that's one of the hardest things to do, especially when we do allow that those inner gremlins to take over, right? Is to show ourselves or tell ourselves, I appreciate this and that about myself. I appreciate that I'm resilient, that I don't give up, that I'm really helpful. I really enjoy what I do. I'm really good at it, right? So start to affirm yourself. I think that helps build a case against the imposter.
Yeah, and if I may add to that a little bit, we spoke about this before, Valerie, about self-compassion. And that's essentially what a summary of what we both shared, right, is the advice that a lot of us are able to give others it's difficult for us to follow ourselves. But if you had a friend saying, I don't think I can do this, are you going to say, no, I don't think you can do that? I mean, I guess it depends on what it is. But if a friend says, I feel overwhelmed, or I just got this new job, I don't know if I have the capacity to meet expectations. I mean, I hope you're the type of friend to say, I believe you can do this. This is why. This is, So if you, and it's really difficult to do. And I can appreciate that. And this is, going back to the question of, can you do this with therapy or not? I do think it's possible. But what I appreciate about my therapist is that he helps me get to those conclusions. He helps me because I struggle to sometimes be self-compassionate. Think, everybody else can do this. I can't. He says, well, why not? Why can't you treat yourself the way you would treat another, right? But yeah, I just wanted to add that to Valerie's point.
No, I think that those are all great pieces of advice. So I love what you mentioned about the brag book. And I had a conversation with someone about that. And they said, well, based on my cultural upbringing, you can't brag. So they actually said, rebrand it as a fact book. Because it's not a brag if it's true and it happened. Right. So it's like, okay, fine. I guess that makes sense. But the whole point is to acknowledge all the things that you have accomplished and something that you can look back to when you are kind of feeling down, because you've accomplished more than you give yourself credit for. Sometimes it's the little wins. Sometimes there are bigger ones that add up over time. Right. And I love what you said about having that therapist, or maybe just a very a friend with a very good compassionate ear that can listen, and oftentimes calling you out on things like, well, why would you treat yourself like that? Because most people wouldn't treat like their worst enemy as they treat themselves, right? So self-compassion is such an amazing skill, and I wish they cultivated that in school. There should be a course on self-compassion that everyone takes.
100%.
And I like also about the therapist, where what I took from that is oftentimes they'll help you with your blind spots, right? So sometimes you take what you think as fact, but you realize, well, no, is that true? Do you actually believe that? There is an author, or Byron Katie, where she has a concept which she calls the work, which is a version of like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, where she asks like 4 simple questions, like, is it true? Do you 100% know it's true? And third one is something like, how does it feel in your body as you feel that thought? And the fourth one is, who would you be without that thought? Right. And I think that one is the key, where if you can change that perspective of who you would be without, I think it can be super helpful. So I think that's a lot of good guidance. And for those that are thinking of, or getting some help, or dealing more with imposter syndrome, are there any resources out there that you might suggest folks to listen to, other than both of your previous podcasts or all the other workshops that both of you run?
Valerie, if you want to start.
Well, I was thinking of a resource that Nahian is involved with, but I don't want to speak for him. If you wanted to talk about that.
You're talking about the book I'm working on? I mean, hopefully, I mean, I don't know if this is like a shameless self plug, but hopefully once that comes out, that might be a resource. But yeah, Valerie also recommended a lot of great resources to me as well. For example, if I may share, Valerie, the therapy that we referred to earlier, it's called internal family systems. And so the person who pretty much created it, I think his name was Richard Schwartz, I believe. And so he has a book on IFS or internal family systems. And I do recommend everyone give that a read, even if it sounds a little bit hocus pocus, or like, kind of like snake oil. I think there's a ring, at least for me, there's a ring of truth to it that, there's, and everybody deals with it. There's that voice that tells you, oh, I can do this. Otherwise, especially in a professional setting, why would you apply for that job? For example, if you don't think you could do this, then there's the other part of you that says, well, you can't do it. Now that you've had the job, how can you have both, right? So I see it as, maybe there are parts. And in talking to the parts, whether or not you believe they exist, you do learn self-compassion. So reading up on internal family systems, I think that would be my recommendation, specifically from the person who created it. So.
That's amazing. And Valerie, do you want to share a different one? Because it seems like you're cross-pollinating each other's resources.
Trying to think. I remember when I was in my 20s, I read this book by Fabienne Fredrickson called Embracing Your Magnificence, and it had a really strong impact on me. I think I read it twice, and I wrote in the margins, and I underlined, and it's about embracing your true unique strengths and talents. And I think when we are able to shift our focus to that helps kind of quiet the imposter syndrome a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And so I mentioned the work, and obviously therapy can be very helpful. And again, having a friend with a compassionate ear and your own self-compassionate ear might be helpful as well. So just to kind of summarize some of the things that we talked about, I think it starts off with really just recognizing that you may or may not have it, right? So having that friend, the therapist or whatever, to kind of help you, that quote that we said, that don't believe everything you think, right? Because it might be from your cultural upbringing, family, those around you, or something else that happened. And then once you recognize that it's there, you want to accept. And basically, you don't want to slay the dragon, as you said, Nat. You want to befriend the dragon, right? It's a partner. They're a protector. They're here to keep you safe, right? So when you recognize that, then ideally you start affirming, right? So whether it's a brag book, a fact book, or whatever you want to talk about that, then showing that you have done a lot more than you think. And then I guess as a preventative measure, there's probably a whole bunch of different inoculations that you can have, like your own imposter syndrome vaccine, if you want to create it by some of these resources, like Embracing Your Magnificence, taking a look at the IFS, the internal family systems as well. And there's probably a bunch of other ones. One tactic that I'll share is to kind of pre-program yourself. Really just take a sheet of paper, on the left side, write all those cases of imposter syndrome, why you're not good enough or whatever. And on the right side, well, what do you want to think instead? Right? What's going to help you? Very, very simple exercise could be helpful as well. So that's a couple of things that I wanted to share in terms of what I took from the discussion. If each of you could share some kind of parting words or thoughts in terms of like imposter syndrome for folks that are struggling with it, maybe what to do with it, resources or anything, like what would be your parting words for this discussion on imposter syndrome? Nahian, maybe we'll start with you. Yeah,
I think, the conversation you have with yourself about imposter syndrome doesn't need to wait for a therapist. I think that a therapist can help uncover some of the factors that may augment it. But ultimately, because the question always becomes why. Like, why do I feel this way, right? And sometimes that's a very deep question. But I think that at the very least, for the surface level issues you may be dealing with when it comes to imposter syndrome, you can have that conversation now of, when you apply for a job, especially, you build a resume. What is a resume if not kind of like your brag list, right? So you have these tools, and you've already recognized at some point in your life, you've already recognized your capacity. Just keep it up. And something that I tell clients to do, especially in those who are trying to get a project management job, I told them to write down all the projects they've managed and their key qualities and responsibilities as a reference sheet. So when they do an interview, they have these, not only do they have these projects listed as examples, but it's also examples of their own successes. So it's kind of a confidence boost. So I think something else I'd like to part everyone with is that if you or if you worry about imposter syndrome and you worry about self-sabotage in an interview, then you can also have the reference sheet. It doesn't need to be just for projects. Just if you know what role you're applying for, have examples of where you fulfill the different responsibilities within that role, and go into this interview with that confidence that I have done it before. Right. So
that's awesome. And Valerie, what would you like to add?
I really like that idea that Nahian shared about having the reference sheet, kind of like a cheat sheet, which can also be used as like the case against the imposter. But I like visual things as well. So having like sheets, or even something you could scribble by hand. I'm a journaler. I like to write. I really like to create mind maps as well. And I like to do that with my clients to help them discover, who they are, what their personal brand is as they are looking for work. So I'm thinking maybe, make a mind map about yourself, right? And write your name in the middle, and then draw little webs about who you are. So maybe your different experiences that you've had, your key qualities, your key traits, what makes you really unique. And I think working with a coach as well, can really help with that. And I love doing it with my clients, because I'll ask them and I'll create the chart for them. Right. And then that helps us build a strong personal brand, which also can be a case against the imposter syndrome and can really help when you're moving through the job search process and as you're building your career.
Yeah, that's amazing. And kind of a subtext to a lot of the recommendations you provided is kind of focused on gratitude and being thankful, compassionate are kind of similar concepts, where if you're grateful for all the things that you have done, and I think you mentioned journaling, there's a journaling technique called a rose journal, where it's a rose gratitude, where rose is an acronym. So R is relationship, like someone that you're connected with, that you're thankful for, usually mom and dad, friends, family, something like that. O is an opportunity, like something that you're going to be able to do in the future. S is something simple. Like I remember someone said, I'm thankful for my thumb, because if I didn't have a thumb, things would be very difficult. Right? And then E is an experience. So it's almost the opposite of the opportunities in the future, experiences the past. So what have you done that you're thankful to be able to do? And 4 little things every day, ideally, when you experience that, actually feel the gratitude for each of those instead of just writing it down. And that will really help, because oftentimes that gratitude, that compassion can be a very effective antidote for that lovely imposter syndrome out there.
Right.
But keep in mind that for most of us, we will live with it. And if you can learn to befriend it, I think that would be the best path forward. So, thanks so much, Valerie and Nahian, for joining us for a conversation on imposter syndrome. And hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
Thank you. My pleasure. And great talking to you again, Valerie. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about this topic, Luki.
Yes, thank you, Luki.
Thanks both. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.